we can move to the Disco project, and Dries that will present to you and dive a little bit deeper on a specific use case from the European project Disco in Ghent, in Belgium. Dries is a business innovation analyst at IMEC, and Dries, I leave you the floor now.
Yes, thank you. Let's see if I can take over. Yeah, seems so. So indeed, maybe a quick introduction in IMEC. IMEC is a international research institute. We mostly do research into microchip technology, but also nowadays more towards AI solutions and data technology. And there we support international projects by doing European projects like these. And I'm specifically a project manager within European projects that focus on data space technology within urban logistics or urban mobility. So it's from that point of view that I'm joining Disco. IMEC in Disco has three roles. The first is really help build out the data space architecture. Secondly is developing and offering tools to cities to help integrate data into the data space. And thirdly, we are supporting the Ghent Living Lab solution and see how we can integrate data spaces in that Living Lab. And we'll mainly focus on the Ghent Living Lab today and how data space is adding value in that specific Living Lab. Let's see if I can. Yeah. So quickly, what is Disco in a nutshell? Disco is a response to the European Green Deal that says by 2050, Europe wants to be self-sustaining. And by 2030, they already want to reduce emissions with 55%. And urban mobility and logistics has been defined as a very important pillar in that emissions reduction. So the goal of Disco fits in that. And the goal is to really accelerate the decarbonization of urban logistics by leveraging these data space enabling tools, by sharing data across the different logistic stakeholders, and really optimizing the logistic processes within cities. So it's a Horizon Europe program, goes from 2023 to 26. It has 8 living lab cities, so 4 leading living labs, 4 following living labs. And it has 5 application domains. And in these 5 application domains, Disco aims to build specific solutions, software solutions. And the purpose of Disco is then to connect the cities, the logistic players, and all these software solutions in one urban freight data space and ensure that these solutions, which are tested in one city, are transferable to other cities as well, and kind of help build up that European landscape of data space urban logistics solutions. So what are we doing in Ghent? Initially, maybe first some context. So the challenges that we encounter in Ghent for urban logistics, I'm sure that many of them sound familiar, is the first is it's a very dense city. It has a lot of urban logistics activities, which can lead to dangerous situations. Large vans that drive into the city at very busy hours in school streets, vans that are parked on the curbside and really blocking the road for a lot of pedestrians and bikes. Secondly, the city of Ghent has several access regulations, but they're still struggling with really transparently communicating these access rules to the logistic players. They have them available on the website, but it's tricky to find them. And then still they have to be manually included in the planning. So there's no automatic integration there, which leads to a lot of logistic players just missing a lot of access rules, which leads then to a lot of errors that they're making, a lot of fines. But also sometimes they just cannot enter the city by without knowing it in beforehand, which leads them to have a missed delivery. So then they have to return to the warehouse and do a last minute urgent delivery, which is another expensive and an extra trip they have to take. And then lastly, Ghent already has a lot of sustainable alternatives. We have cargo bikes, we have electric van transport companies. But these are having a hard time to really get integrated into these logistic processes. So they're available, but they're not tapping into the potential yet that they could have. So it's in these topics that we want to focus. And then the key focus of the Ghent use case is to integrate the city access rules directly in the planning tools of the logistic companies. So then you have efficient communication of the access rules. You integrate the rules directly in the planning tools, so you're going to have the most efficient route without any errors. And this way, Ghent can use that integration not only to highlight what are the hard rules, what is not allowed, what is restricted, but also to suggest optimizations. And this way, nudge logistic players into desired behavior. So the urban access control, it's an application currently being built and commercialized by a software company, B-Mobile. So regardless of data spaces, this is a commercial application that is being built now. So if there are cities or companies that are interested, they can reach out to me or B-Mobile for this application. It will be commercially available. So what does the urban access controller do? Initially, first, it integrates the access rules in the planning tool. It highlights all the access rules. It highlights the points of interest that could be in effect, like, for example, where are there low bridges, where are there school streets, parking locations, things like that. It integrates green last mile alternatives, and that way it can calculate alternative sustainable routes in comparison with the route that you are now taking. And it offers real-time navigation through those points of interest. So it can give you a real-time view that there's a parking location there, there's a school street, maybe you can bypass that one. So this is a way to kind of highlight the points of interest and reroute transporters into more desired routes. Urban access control consists of three components. The first is the access regulation manager, which is kind of a 2D map for the city to input their access rules. So they can highlight zones and say, this is a low emission zone, this is a school zone. They can highlight points, they can highlight streets. And this way they can build up all the access regulations within their city. Then you have the policy rule engine, which is a logic and a software engine that is directly connected with the planning tool. And it makes a bridge between the access rules of the city and the planning of the logistic planners. And it starts defining the mistakes. It starts offering suggestions and integrating these access rules and optimizations into the planning tools. And then for during the navigation, you have a route guidance app that shows real-time the points of interest. So those are the three components. Maybe let's zoom in them a bit more in depth so you really see how it works. So those are the three components, and those are all the stakeholders. So in the bottom left, you have the city policy managers. You have the logistic planners who are using a planning tool to plan their routes. You have the transporters who are actually driving through the cities and transporting them. And at the top, you have all the local green last mile transporters. So the cargo bikes, the electric bikes, in the future, maybe like little drone or drone deliveries, who knows? So everything is in there. So first, the city starts integrating their access rules into the location manager. So what are the hard rules? What are the soft rules, the desired behavior that we want to nudge? And where are all the points of interest? Then the local green last mile transporters directly integrate their service offerings in the policy rule engine. So they say, these are our location, these are the capabilities that we have, and this is the availability that we might have. We're also looking into integrating costs already, but that's always difficult because costs are also always very dynamic. But we are trying to get at least a certain reference point. So then this is a direct API connection between the policy rule engine and the planning tool. So the policy rule engine kind of pulls the planning tool out of the TMS device, and it compares it with the access rules here and with the green last mile alternatives. And it detects conflicts, it offers optimizations, and it offers alternatives or it nudges desired behavior. And then while the transporter is driving, the route guidance app, it will navigate it through the desired routes. It will highlight the points of interest. And this part additionally could even be a third-party application because you have a lot of transport companies which are subcontracted and they have their own route navigation app. So this can also be an API connection. Shall I already go to a question now or shall I wait until the end?
I think I would say you can finish your presentation and take all the questions at the end, if that works for you.
Sorry?
Yeah. No one sees you on the camera, apparently.
No one sees me?
Or some people, at least.
Do it this way as well, then you have a double view. Good. So that is a tool. As you can see here at the moment, there's no data space integration yet. This purely works on API connections at the moment, but still then, it already offers a lot of benefit. For the city, this means that they can increase the transparency of their access rules, directly integrate them in the planning tool, and nudge desired behavior. For the logistic players, this means that they can avoid mistakes, avoid fines, and avoid missed deliveries, and optimize their urban deliveries. And then for the green last mile solution, because we're integrating them as alternatives, it offers more visibility of the alternative solution. This is what we have built now. We're going to start testing it already in Q4 this year. And now in a second phase, we're connecting that into the data space. So how that looks connected is you have a direct data space connection between the city and its access rules, a direct data space connection between the urban access control and its components, and then a data space connection between all the service offerings of the green last mile transporter. So we're consolidating them in a database and we're connecting that. The planning tool of the TMS system, we're still doing through a direct API connection because it's a third-party company. It's always with commercially sensitive data. And as the previous presentation has showed, there's still challenges in how you can have clear payment models around data sharing, all the trust issues, especially if you're with commercially sensitive data. So at the moment, it's still easier to do this through API connections. But so we're integrating now 3 points for a data space connection. And then you can say, why are you doing this? Because if you look at this way, it works fine as well. There, I'll start maybe with a disclaimer. Data space integration has already been explained in the previous presentation. At the moment, it still brings additional challenges for the cities. We got a lot of response from cities that just say, I have an open data portal. It has an open API. If you want to have data, come and get it. Which at the moment is a fair point, because if you're working with a data space, where a city now, they have an open portal, they have an open API, they don't have to look at it anymore. If you're working with data spaces, that means that the city has to invest in integrating that data space connector and has to invest in building up that technical know-how. And especially a lot of smaller cities will not have that technical expertise in-house. So that is at the moment a response that we're making. I do want to say, so the point there, which I want to make now, is there is a big value of data spaces. And in a nutshell, the benefit that data spaces brings is it reduces the barrier of logistic players to integrate within this city ecosystem of all the access rules, the monitoring applications, all the logistic services, the mobility services. So it's a very great tool to create a scalable, low-effort ecosystem of mobility as a service and logistic as a service applications that bring benefit for everyone. And that is kind of the point I want to make in the second part now of my presentation. So what does that mean? Well, let's start with an example. So currently, in the normal way, you have a planner, and they plan a route. Often, a logistic route is across different cities. So they go to city A, they go to city B, they go to city C. Every city has their own access rules. Some are a bit consistent, some have little variations, like the low emission zone in city A could be until Euronorm 3. The low emission zone in city B is up until Euronorm 4. There's no clear communication or a clear consistency across the rules, which leads that sometimes there's mistakes, and mistakes are fine. So that is the situation as it is. Planners have to manually look up all the rules of all the cities, the planning tools are often not smart enough to kind of integrate those rules. So what means is the planning tools give a result, and then the planner manually has to take out all the mistakes and kind of redo everything or redo several things. So what if you do with data space? Then you can have a direct API connection between the cities that have their access rules on an open data portal. And you can pull that in the route planner, and it can kind of incorporate those access rules. That's what it is. That's what's being done now. Without data spaces, you have one API connection per city, which means if there's more cities, then that planning tool needs to make an extra API connection for every city. And that becomes at some point a cluster of API connections that become very costly and very hard to scale. And that's just if you have data in one direction. If you want to have collaboration between stakeholders, it becomes even more complicated. And then in the future, the cities are more and more doubling down on sustainable urban logistics, which means they're going to more and more start working with enforcement tools, monitoring tools, guidance tools. So first one is data. Data is knowledge. So the cities want to get as much data as they can collected in a city dashboard, which means maybe in the future, cities will make it mandatory for you to connect with their dashboarding tools. They'll make it mandatory to connect with enforcement tools, so you're complying to their rules, which is, again, another API connection per tool. We have done interviews with logistic players for Disco, and you notice that at some point, more and more, they're getting frustrated with this. And one of them said, the cities are bullying us out of the city. If this continues, we're just going to drop it somewhere and they'll have to make it work by their own, but we're not going to deliver in the cities yet. It's becoming too costly for logistic players at this rate with the API connections. So there brings the value of data spaces. Currently, if you want to do connections, like I say, you have to have a bilateral API connection. And if you want to have a community that collaborates, every one of that API connections needs to have an understanding of the other stakeholders involved in the community and their access rules. So if you add another stakeholder to this group, all the API connections need to be rebuilt to incorporate the logic of that additional stakeholder, which is, again, very cumbersome. If you're looking at big logistic collaboration platforms, you have onboarding periods of 2 years just because the connections all need to change to incorporate an additional stakeholder. Whereas if you go to data space collaboration, every stakeholder has one API connection or one data space connection. And all those logics, all those concerns are kind of pulled out of the connector and put in separate concerns. I'm not going to go into the technical details now, but the benefit of a data space is that making a community this way becomes much, much more scalable, much more cost effective. And in fact, you need one connection to be connected with the whole ecosystem. So let's say we would continue with the urban access control with this logic. In the future, this is how it could look like. You could have the urban access control has one data space connection. Every city has one connection with their access rules. All the last mile transporters have one connection. And you can very easily build up an ecosystem of all the last mile operators, all the cities, and all the logistic applications. And now if I am a logistic service provider or a software provider, instead of making all these one-on-one API connections with partners, I just connect to the data space and I say my services are available in the data space. And you can easily subscribe to my service in there. So that is the value and the future of how we see data space ecosystems. So that's the key conclusion of my presentation. Then if we want to get to that urban logistics mobility ecosystem, we really need to enable scalable, interoperable collaborations between not only actors in a city, but between cities as well. And that's something you can do with data spaces. And that brings value for all the stakeholders. For cities, that helps them integrate the guidance, integrate enforcement and monitoring tools without pushing logistic players to invest in costly connections. For logistic players, you tap into this whole ecosystem of logistic services, of alternative partners, can help optimize your services and streamline your processes. And for the government, data spaces is a way to kind of create consistency, scalability, standardization between different cities, which is still at the moment, they're a bit islands that are operating on their own, and they're like relying, or they're looking a bit at each other, but there's no streamlined, standardized way of complying to these rules. So that is a bit in a nutshell what we're trying to create in Disco. It will not be finished within Disco by far, but it will be a first catalyst to get that mass loss ecosystem that we are promoting here that you can get with data spaces. So with that, I conclude the presentation, and maybe I see a lot of questions coming in. Maybe Marion or Anne-Charlotte, you can kind of moderate.
Yes, thank you very much, Dries, for this very detailed and interesting presentation. We have a question from Juanjo asking about if the city pretend that the logistic operator used the urban access control application and how it can be integrated with routing planners' logistic operations. So you partly answered that, but then there is a second part of that question on technical standards for defining access rules. So maybe I will let you answer to that already.
So the question is, are there technical standards for defining access rules then?
Exactly. Yeah.
A very important thing of making data spaces work is you have to have data standards, which means you have to have data standards for every type of data that you want to put in there, which definitely at the beginning is a big effort. It's a one-time effort. Once a standard is defined and accepted by the community, that's scalable to all applications. We did a first proof of concept for parking data, and there we based ourselves on the European Parking Alliance. They have a standard. So it's mostly looking at what is already available and promoted on a European level. Access rules is a unique one, or a special one. There's no standard yet defined. There's currently a few projects ongoing that are defining standards. I think the main thing there is it needs to be based on DATEX2. DATEX2 is a very large, how would you describe that, Casper? A logistics data model?
Multi-data model even. It's a
mobility, transport.
Transport, yeah.
Yeah, it's a very big transport data model, and it holds a lot of information. And it's usually just a case of analyzing that data model and cherry picking the things that are relevant for your use case, and then saying this is the data model, but it's based on the DATEX2 standard. And that already gives you a big carrying power to get that Europeanly recognized. So for access rules, there are currently 2 projects ongoing. The first one is in Flanders. There's an Oslo trajectory, they're called. So it's a trajectory specifically from the Flemish government with sector companies to kind of define standards. And there's one to define access rules, and the same group of people that are building here the Ghent Living Lab, so IMEC, BeMobile, and VIL, the Flemish Institute of Logistics, we are also involved in that trajectory. So we're kind of trying to make sure that there's consistency between the thing we're working out in Disco and then the data standard that they're working out. That's on Flemish level, so not European yet. On the European level, there is a project called Greenloch. And Greenloch wants to build, I think, an international marketplace for green last mile alternative transporters. And for that, they're also making a data standard now, but that's still ongoing. I don't know if that answers your question a bit, or are you looking for a really technical question?
It seems it's not okay.
Yeah.
Okay, then it's fine. Perfect. Then maybe you have Dries' contact also. I guess if you want to dive deeper in the question, maybe you can reach out to him. But anyway, thank you very much, Dries. As you can see in the chat, your presentation was highly appreciated. I think especially because you took the time to define the value for each stakeholder and the challenges also faced in the elaboration of such tools. So that was very interesting. Thanks a lot.